start by introducing our speaker. For those of you who've been here, we have had, I think, a nice flow of topics that have overlapped appropriately and had some very good speakers and some great discussion. Our speaker this morning, I want to introduce him as Claude Drouet, but as he explains to me, he goes by Claude Drouet because we live in a state that has a for sales. He is a native of Louisiana. He has a Master's of Art in History from LSU Baton Rouge and a Master's of Divinity from the old Southern Baptist Seminary.
Let's stress that.
1981. And a Master's in Science and Social Work from our own University of Louisville Kent School. As a past employee of 7 County Services, he assisted with the initiation of new community-based outreach programs on behalf of persons with mental illness. He also led education efforts regarding mental illness in local Louisville churches, engaging seminary students to be peer supports in the community. He has served on boards of the Jefferson County Court Diversion Program and the Mental Health Association of Kentucky, being actually a past president of that organization. So I would say over his career, it appears he has specialized in the practice of community-based mental health and has also worked extensively with employee-assisted programs. But he currently works, mostly these days, with health professionals dealing with substance abuse issues and in consultation working with families. He is a part-time instructor still at the Kent School, teaching continuing education units in ethics, licensure, and diagnostic procedures. And we're very appreciative for you to be here. And this is not the first time you've been here. He was here about 10 years ago. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you guys. When Megan and Kevin first approached me about presenting today, I was aware that Dr. Hall had been here the week previous to talk about the opioid crisis. You will hear me interleave a little bit of that. I hope I won't rehash what Dr. Hall said, but because the substance issues that are affecting our country are profoundly impacting community mental health, emotional health in families, and has possibly become the #1 issue for so many psychiatrists, psychologists, clinical social workers, and now marriage and family therapists. I want to put a plug in for your seminary. When the Baptist Seminary left the business of community social work ministries back in 1996, just by happy circumstance, Kentucky passed the licensure for marriage and family therapies, and your seminary stepped up to the plate and fully implemented a program that it's my privilege to get to work with many of the graduates of that program who are now gearing up to deal with greatly troubled families. You might know the LMFT program first was pretty much family and marriage counseling, but LMFTs now have, like social workers, have had to broaden their scope into the medical and paramedical realm because of the drug crisis. And your seminary is turning out some of the most distinguished therapists for the nation. Happily, some of them settled here. And I just wanted, I especially want Presbyterians to know how the seminary has been able to step up to the plate under the direction of Dr. Lauren Townsend and the staff. Kentucky, in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Commonwealth of Kentucky was one of several states that were absolute leaders in innovative mental health programs. It all started with President John F. Kennedy, and then President Johnson continued that and even expanded it under his Great Society anti-poverty programs. For the first time in Kentucky's history, mental health clinics and mental health catchment areas were established in Kentucky, particularly in the Appalachian region and in western Kentucky, where there was shockingly little help for individuals, both in the mountain areas and in the delta areas of the Mississippi of our state. Louisville had always been fortunate, as Lexington Fayette had been fortunate, with private psychiatry, psychology, and other services. But that is how our, it's now called Centerstone, but that is how 7 county services, and its original name was River Region, came into being. And many of you in here might remember River Region having troubles and going bankrupt. It did. But it quickly came back as 7 counties and became a resounding success. So Kentucky was a leader in the community mental health movement. That started to change in the 1990s, and I'll get to that in a minute. I was fortunate enough, having finished my seminary degrees and my U of L degrees in the early 80s, to be able to enjoy the tail end of that expansion. And indeed, 7 counties made money available to me and a staff I hired to start new forms of outreach programs, which I'm happy to say are still intact under a supported living program. Back in the 80s, people in the public were particularly fearful of individuals with schizophrenia and also with severe bipolar disorders. Of course, they weren't fully understood. They still are not fully understood. We were also experiencing an uptick in the United States of schizophrenia, particularly among young adult males ages 18 to 22, much higher than the worldwide rate of schizophrenia. Again, etiology of that unknown. If you'll also recall, I believe it was the attempted assassination of President Reagan by John Hinckley, a severely delusional man, that further kind of, raised concerns. There had always been stigma toward the mentally ill. It's just been steeped in our American history. As a matter of fact, it goes back to our roots in Europe and all over the world. If you'll recall, individuals who suffered from depression or suicidality were shunned in their communities throughout the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. So part of our job as community educators and advocates was to do education and advocacy. And here's where Louisville hits one of its glories. Just at that time, an unusual combination happened. The state made money available to do experimental programs to help keep young, severely mentally ill adults in the community rather than in the revolving doors of Central State or Eastern State Hospital. At the same time, Dr. Herbert Wagemaker, Stephen Perkins, who is still active here in the community, and Kathy Dobbins came together to help form the Schizophrenia Foundation Wellspring House, which was the city's first private residential treatment facility for severely mentally ill young adults. I graduated in August of '82. I happened to be their first part-time social work hire. They couldn't hire me full-time because half of the house was female, and all the staff were male. So fortunately, Ms. Dobbins joined the staff in October of that year, and of course she's still there. She is executive director. She has taken it, despite all their many successes, she and her board have taken the Wellspring organization, which is now internationally known and respected, to a whole new level. Scattered site housing for persons with mental illness all over the county, and high quality housing. So I'm happy to report to you that one of the initiatives from the early 80s is not only alive and well, it's gone to another level of excellence, and I think their theme is still housing and hope for persons affected by mental illness. Also, Ms. Teresa Watson, who is still active at Centerstone, formerly 7 counties, helped reorganize the Coalition for the Homeless in reaching out to the homeless mentally ill on the streets of Louisville. Many of you are probably aware of St. John's Center for the homeless. All of this was another part of the initiative of 7 counties. Ms. Watson, a psychiatric nurse and a tireless source of energy, literally helped invent many of the services that we can even take for granted now. And of course, the Louisville Coalition for the Homeless, and I'm going to hand out a little handout in a minute that gives you some of the websites in case you want to find out more about these organizations. For my part, I hired a staff, many young seminarians, idealistic ones, to do home visits, to go into people's apartments and homes, to help them understand how to take their medicines, to help them understand the importance of eating fairly correctly, because many persons with mental illness would skip meals, sometimes for days, which would throw off your medications. Also help family members understand, and here's a difficult part, back in the day, our medicines had many side effects, some of which were truly awful. Indeed, many times we would have to pull people off medicines because of just unacceptable side effects. Fortunately, in the late 80s, several breakthroughs started happening. Through some private monies, we were able to be amongst the first in the country to start with Claude medication, which at the time was $900 a month. It had to be carefully monitored, but it had amazing therapeutic results with dramatically fewer side effects. Today, we're very, very fortunate with 2 particular breakthrough medicines. Cyproxa, when it's used carefully. Cyproxacan, Lilly was forced to admit in an unfortunate lapse of judgment, they suppress some data on diabetes. And so but Cyproxa is still a life-saving drug that can be taken orally. For people with severe mental illnesses, a medicine called Invega Sustenna or Invega Extenda. Again, the medicine is quite expensive, $500 to $700 monthly. Happily, the Commonwealth makes it available under Medicaid. Of course, as we'll talk in a bit, we all know that Medicaid is under pressure and being questioned. So, thankfully, because of some breakthrough drugs, persons with long-term schizophrenia, persons with bipolar is a much more common illness that can really affect any given community. There are 2 types of it, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 1, which my team specialized in, is a little bit more difficult to manage. And again, happily, we have breakthrough medicines nowadays that even private psychiatrists, even private family doctors and interns feel safe and secure enough in using to be administered and prescribed in regular general medical practices. You have to forgive me, sinuses today. So the medicines have been greatly improved, but unfortunately, we're still very, very wide of the mark for 2 reasons. We've hit a wall in research, and one of the reasons is not pleasant to talk about, but it has to be discussed. The pharmaceutical industry does not find these to be as profitable. So research money has slowed down in the United States. Some other countries continue to pour money into, hoping to further develop, but there has been a slowdown in research. Secondly, And on a brighter note, we're discovering there are other ways, often, to help people cope with symptoms. And compared to when I started my career in the early 80s, we understand a lot more about the onsets of illnesses, and we can identify them sooner. And that is true progress. Also, stigma is being reduced. And I must say that of all the challenges we've had in Louisville over the years, many individuals were worried about Mill Spring House. And people living in the old Louisville community had some legitimate concerns. This is purely my opinion. If Barry and Mary Bingham had not funded it and stood firm with concerned citizens, it might have been a tougher sell. The late Phil Artery, Bob Todd, are community leaders who put their heads and hearts and money on the line to advocate and really address the stigma and fears. That's one reason I used to talk to church groups, helping wonderful, compassionate church people, have a better understanding of these illnesses. And of course, many times, since mental illness is extraordinarily democratic, it affects rich and poor, educated, non-educated, almost in equal proportions. There is no safe haven from the possibility of developing. Growing up in my family with my father's severely mentally ill sister, who sought to take her life and lived vegetatively for 7 years, with what we know now as a bipolar I illness. I saw as a kid the firsthand devastation that would rip through a family. One of the wonderful things that's happening for us in our community, and I'll go back to marriage and family therapists, a whole new young bunch, even though there's a lot of bad in the world. It's my privilege, I get to see a lot of the good. Brilliant young professionals coming online from our graduate schools here in Louisville, who are extremely adept at handling even the most challenging cases, and barely bat an eyelash. That's the good news. There is bad news. With our increasing political divisiveness, with our escalating cost, and I know it's not politically correct to say, but with the politics of insurance, it's getting harder and harder for the average citizen to access care. If an individual has a Medicaid card, you're in luck. Some of my clients on Medicaid can buy services that me or my family could not remotely afford under our insurance because of $4,000, $6,000 deductibles, 60% copays. Some of the medicines we use, antidepressants, mood stabilizers, those are the medicines that help folks with bipolar disorders, and also significant recurrent depressions. Many times those medicines cost retail $400 to $800 a month. If you have a typical insurance policy in the United States, it might pay for 40% to 60% of the cost. If you're on multiple meds, people try to pick and choose what they can afford and what they can't, which, as you can imagine, throws off their treatment regimen. And then it causes greater problems. I'm not criticizing our government. because our government reflects our attitudes as a congregate people. Kevin asked me to suggest several action plans for concerned persons, and I'll tell you that will be one of them, to suggest you contact your representatives, senators, if you're so moved, to discuss your concerns about insurance access in America. I'm not saying everything should be free. I believe in accountability and responsibility. As a matter of fact, one of the paradigm shifts we've done for persons with significant mental illness in the destigmatization process, we've tried to move it to an analogy of diabetes. It's not fair, it's not right that I have diabetes, but I got it. It's up to me to be accountable to myself, to make informed decisions, get education, stay in touch with my doctor, or nowadays, all the insurance companies have superb diabetic nurses available 24/7 on one-pager lines or email. So the same thing is true for persons with severe mental illness. It's not fair, it's not right, it's far from the ideal. But by making wise choices and getting the support to make them, increasingly, the vast majority of persons with severe mental illness, and those are the bipolar 1 and schizoaffective schizophrenia, can lead very satisfying and productive lives. One of the joys of my 37 years in this work, I've actually been able to see several handfuls of my clients be able to get off disability, be able to work, never more than part-time, and happily, with expanded standards, being able to keep their Medicaid or Medicare, so they can stay insured and work. And so that is because of support services and our refined pharmaceuticals, as imperfect as they are. But now we're coming up on a time of three real significant challenges. Unprecedented demand, just absolutely unprecedented demand. A drug crisis that you hear a lot about it, but we still don't have a lot of understanding about it. We just don't have a good understanding. The sociologists, psychologists at National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda are working night and day to understand this better. And then our increasing reliance on electronic devices, and I'm not a Luddite, I promise, but it's changing the way we communicate with one another. And for persons that have emotional issues or mental health issues, it is having more and more of a profound effect. Part of my part-time work with psychiatrists, I do consult work for about 8 psychiatrists here in town, and I see kids. I don't treat children, but I do consults. Since I teach, I know dozens of wonderful professionals. I'm kind of like a resource broker. And kids are having trouble in school, kids are having trouble at home. I have moms who will text their child to come downstairs for dinner because she's fearful, or he's fearful, of knocking on the door and insisting that they come down for dinner. So the electronic devices are hijacking our imagination about ourselves and about our relationships with others. And I want to be clear, like everybody else, I like my phone and my iPad. You might have even noticed we've been a little slow in getting them, but they've been popping up on several of the TV stations. Check your device. I don't know if you've seen the ads, but where family get-togethers, and of course they're silly, they're literally metal detecting their kids and grandkids. They have to put their device in the basket at the door. The Mormon Church for 10 to 15 years out in Utah have been running ads like this. In Europe, I've noticed with my friends in Europe, more and more of them have set dinner times, no device on whatsoever. And of course in France, those dinners can last 2 hours, but it's changing. And it's even changing the way mentally ill individuals interact with the world. So I want to get back though to the pressing demand. None of us professionals have any clear-cut ideas what to do. Louisville is probably one of those, I'm proud to say Louisville is kind of my adopted hometown. Growing up in the Delta of North Louisiana, but living in St. Louis and Philadelphia. I moved here for school, but I was so amazed at the graciousness of this community. Of course, I think everyone in this room knows that after the scary tornadoes of '74, Louisville bound together to create community ministries, which we might take for granted here. Believe me, other cities do not have this. They have a patchwork, maybe, but it's amazing what a community of this size has done. But we're having trouble keeping up. We're having trouble keeping up. And the mental health system is, I'm not going to say it's broken, because it's not. But it simply cannot keep up. And there are no clear answers. There are no clear answers yet. One of the things I hope for the most is some of our leaders who I've had the privilege of speaking to privately to articulate a vision. You don't even have to have a plan just yet, but to get people involved. Since an emotional distress situation or mental illness can happen to any of us at any time in our life, none of us are immune to it, I'm sorry to say. With all our political infighting, it just isn't happening. That's where I love to appeal to congregations, thoughtful congregations, to be mindful when if they do happen to write to a legislator or to talk it up in their church community. That kind of raised awareness, and I know that sounds nebulous, but that does powerfully help. It also sends a message to your immediate neighborhood, a compassionate and understanding congregation. Regarding the drugs, as I told you, the National Institute of Mental Health is really trying to pore over the data. We're seeing pressure to legalize cannabis. It's going to probably be legal in Kentucky. And here's where I get in trouble with some folks. Cannabis is probably my most detested drug. It's the only drug me and my little family's safety have ever been threatened of. Cannabis is an oddly tricky substance. It is not physiologically addictive. A person can quit marijuana and not have any significant physiological withdrawal. Ironically, nicotine and alcohol withdrawal can have powerful withdrawal. But what pot does, particularly for young people, pot insinuates itself into our emotional, the part of our brain that processes our emotions. And for a significant number of individuals, they can come to see it as literally the substance that mediates my sense of well-being. That's where when I had to pull a union permit, drug permit to work hard, they were building, I think, the Young Center. Fellow showed up at my door a few days before Christmas, looked at my mortgage plat, found my address, found personal information about me and my partner, and, you know, and kind of thought they would be ashamed for anything to happen to you, you know, and your little family before Christmas. A few weeks later, he came back and apologized. I knew the guy. I didn't think he was serious, but it did rattle. But that's an example, and I deal with it almost every day. I go into the office with a young person. Mr. Claude, you just don't get it. Of course, he's in a nice private school, flunking out, taking money from mom or dad, either with a wink and a grin, folks shrugging their shoulders, or they don't know what's missing. And then gets picked up in trouble. That's a big part of my business nowadays. So we're really struggling. Some of my colleagues even, not in the drug counseling business, but some of my other colleagues believe I'm a little bit old-fashioned. But I see doctors and nurses walk away from, the power of a drug is amazing. You can actually see a doctor walk away from a $500,000 a year hospital position for their drug of choice. That's power. That's power. Or a nurse risk a distinguished 20-year career because he or she decides to, we don't call it stealing, we call it diverting. And taking something from the Pyxis, the dispensing machine, and put it in their pocket of their purse. Nowadays, 4K high-definition cameras literally track you, even in hallways of hospitals, and particularly entering and exiting, not in the restrooms, thankfully, but in and out of restrooms. So that's how powerful a substance is when it hijacks our prefrontal cortex and our judgment emotional center. And so we're still trying to figure how to respond to this, because the public believes, and again, I don't want people that pot is okay. That's why Colorado, California are being studied very carefully to see how this is playing out in the legal states. So the other problem with pot that the public doesn't seem to hear about a lot, it has a cumulative effect. Pot stays in the body, depending on your body mass disposition, for up to 6 weeks. The more heavy set a person is, the longer it resides in our adipose fat system, our abdominal fat. And so it starts having exponential effects. It's not popular to discuss, and it doesn't affect all people adversely. That is true. But we're going to have to figure out an approach on this as it does become socially acceptable, and it probably will become. States are seeing that they can balance their votes on it. I'm just hoping that they'll set aside treatment monies from the revenues to help folks. I'm going to wind down, but I don't want to end on that negative note because I would like, and I made a copy of this, if you're interested in learning more about Here at Home, or even thinking of a way that you can contribute or participate, the Louisville Coalition for the Homeless, and I have the website, Wellspring, which is the housing provider and service provider for severely mentally ill. I want to put a plug in for NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, which was not founded by Rosalind Carter, President Carter's wife, but she gave it a huge boost of recognition. Almost single-handedly when she started, she had the audacity to start talking about mental illness in the family in 1977. She raised a few eyebrows then. Maybe some of you have heard Ms. Carter. She's been here 3 times in the past 20 years. She has slowed down at 95, but is still a tireless of the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. And Louisville has a very strong, it's now called NAMI Louisville. We used to call it LAMI, Louisville Alliance for the Mentally Ill. It's primarily a family group, families who have been directly impacted by a severely mentally ill son or daughter, but it is widened and broadened out. Run by the magnificent Jean Henry, who was a psych social worker at Our Lady Peace for 20 years. She retired from Peace and is now the eloquent spokesman. And it's an organization that particularly, even if your family thankfully hadn't been affected by that illness, they love to welcome people in for additional support and also to disseminate information about services for the mentally ill. Centerstone, which is formerly 7 counties, and it's unclear about how they're reorganizing things, but I have to say we're extraordinarily fortunate that they have maintained their commitment. Many mental health centers have scaled back or even started projects, which are fine, to make money. I'm all for that. But Centerstone folks have kept their commitment to serving the mentally ill in the community. I also want to add, I didn't put this on my list because they're sectarian, but St. Vincent de Paul, Volunteers of America, Salvation Army have been tireless in their work and in their mission. I'm particularly fond, St. Vincent would take many of my bipolar men who, forgive me, were riding cowboy, because the medicines in the old days took 4 to 6 weeks. They would take them in, I would give them my beeper, my pager, and they knew I'd show up, but they would take some of my most difficult young male clients and give them a chance in their housing, and they still do. But the Centerstone organization, we're fortunate they have kept their focus and their commitment. Any questions or comment or rebuttal?
Where does post-traumatic stress fit into on what you've been talking about, either from the military or from people who
Well,
live in
and I dropped
violence?
it, in my nervousness, I dropped a piece. Not only our veterans are being buffeted, it started in 1992 with the first Gulf War, Desert Storm. PTSD has taken on near epidemic proportions in the United States. I'm happy to tell you that the VA Center here, even though it's overwhelmed, they have specialized teams and therapists to help veterans of all ages. Remember, there are a lot of 60s and 70s and early 80-year-old Vietnam vets that probably have been underserved over the years for PTSD. Private psychiatrists have started some innovative treatment programs. Probably one of the most effective ones for many, many people is something called EMDR, rapid eye movement desensitization, ironically developed by the Pentagon in the 1980s to deal with wartime traumas. And they built their work on the Palo Alto group from the 1950s out in California, which was basically German refugee, brilliant German refugees that fled Hitler's Germany, loved California, and developed the revolution in cognitive behavioral therapies and increased psychology insights. So that work was done, then the Pentagon, of all people, took it up and developed it into these techniques, which are amazingly effective without medicine. And PTSD, left unattended, can morph into profound emotional disorders. And then, my friends, emotional disorders long enough can start morphing into mental illness disorders.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Please.
What about families that live in areas with high levels of violence?
Again, this is where there are a lot of studies being done on children. Of course, our community has become far more violent. I'm ashamed to say, a couple of Fridays ago, 10 o'clock in the morning, I was taking some old electronics to the e-recycle place in West Louisville. And I'm ashamed to say I was startled by folks drunk asleep on the street. One gentleman approached me in the car, and you know, a sign of getting old, I was startled, even though I used to work in the slums of North Philadelphia. And so I don't have any wonderful insights to offer. We're having trouble with increasing poverty. People being displaced from the middle and what we used to call blue collar and falling hard into near poverty or living paycheck to paycheck. And so I do know the Coalition for the Homeless is tackling the violence problem. Regarding PTSD and accessing treatment for PTSD, I can't lie. It's hard for people that don't have insurance or a certain level of means. I would add, here's what, my neighborhood, I worked for a Head Start program with impoverished white children in North Philadelphia. Horrendously segregated and racist community called Fishtown. It's where the old movie Rocky was partly filmed. If a black or Hispanic moved into the neighborhood I worked in, they were firebombed out within typically a week or two. It made progress in the 80s and 90s, thankfully because of young Manhattanites who could not afford housing in Manhattan could take the hour train ride to North Philadelphia. In the past 10 years, however, because of our drug crisis, the Central Avenue, which is Frankfurt Avenue, and the elevated subway runs above you before it goes downtown a mile from the Liberty Bell, is now heroin alley, where even Philadelphia police, they won't arrest you. And so hundreds to 1,000 people are shooting up 24/7. All the little shops, the Polish delicatessens, everything have all gone. And it's just a horrific wasteland, and I'm deeply fond of Philadelphia, in our nation's birthplace. You can see this in LA. I'm happy to say we don't have it here yet. One of the terrible prognostications is if the drug crisis continues unabated, people will live outside of cities in trailer park communities where professional people with guards will come in to try to help on any given day, but they'll literally become, you know, separate. I hope that never, ever happens. In closing, I failed to also add a bright spot. The advent of Vivitrol and political and citizen advocacy to have access to Vivitrol is a godsend. Vivitrol is a shot, $700 a month. That's an opioid antagonist, and it helps heroin addicts, opioid addicts. It greatly assists them staying clean. It's an oral medication too called naltrexone, but you got to take it every day. For people that are severely addicted, the Vivitrol shot is the best way to go. It is saving, I know, I have 24 folks, I believe it has saved the life of. The Kentucky Medicaid card will pay for it. The Kentucky Medicaid card will pay for it. There is an article today, an editorial, I can't think of Chris's last name right now, he owns St. Matthew's Community Pharmacy, right there in humble St. Matthew's. Those folks save more lives every day in a classy environment, compassionate, and a lot of folks don't even know it's there. Which I think is just fine, as long as the people who need it know it's there. So that's another piece of good news, and hopefully in closing, I have hopes that the neuropsychopharmacologists will find a way to help people with severe alcohol addictions and addictions to tranquilizers, benzos, which is also really taking a toll on our community. Any other questions? I hope I've been more hopeful. I sound so negative, right?
Question back from Brad.
Yes, sir.
This problem of drug and substance abuse,
Yes, sir.
it's been developing, it looks like it's gotten worse over the last 50 years.
Yes, sir.
Is there a point to where we ought to say, we've criminalized it now to a certain extent. Is there a point where the federal government or the government should say we need to legalize this to get a handle on it so that we can treat it? Where are you at?
In a way, that's the direction we're going with cannabis, not the opioids. As a matter of fact, we Americans, and I know it's almost time to go, but just to show you how kind of ambivalent, when poor people and people of color abused heroin in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we criminalized it. As mainstream America got hooked, we made it into a health crisis. Our government is even ambivalent. I asked a friend of mine in D.C. when I was president of the Mental Health Association, had lunch with one of my LSU buddies who was high up with a well-known political figure, and I asked her, Shannon, maybe I don't expect a Democrat to do this, but haven't some of the more conservative politicians thought about talking about soundness of mind and readiness, being drug-free? Wouldn't that be a selling point? I'm not recommending it, I was just curious. She looked at me like I was crazy and said, Claude, no politician in their right mind is going to alienate 20 to 40% of their base. So, and when Mrs. Clinton was questioned, when she was Secretary of State, about the cartel violence, she said something extremely truthful. If America didn't have an insatiable appetite, they'd have no market. Even President Obama, her boss, stepped away from her as she caught a firestorm of criticism. Well, there you go, blaming the victim of drug abuse. So Americans, we're ambivalent about the attitude. Cannabis, I dare say, will be legalized. I'm for decriminalization because we've filled the jails with people that could, I believe, easily be rehabilitated. But I'm not sure we Americans believe in rehabilitation. My good buddy, Dr. Richard Purvis, when I was president of the health center, he had a wonderful rehab program out of the prison. He was, I regard it as fire for mollycoddling inmates and helping them get treatment, and also advocating for good health care. So, sir, I don't know. It's a risky gambit. We're going to find out. But the opioids, I doubt if we will ever. Opioids are so dangerous. And I've had so many young people just say, Mr. Claude, my life, when I shot, I just felt wonderful. And you can see that they are entering another world. So I'll be a stick in the mud, hoping those never. The cannabis thing it's going to be a social experiment, I think. And it's going to take people a lot smarter than me to figure it out. Anything else? I know it's not, but yes.
How much of the homelessness, how much is homelessness related to mental illness?
A considerable amount. And I felt badly for our mayor not too long ago when he wanted to get some homeless folks off the street. And it seems like they could have done it better. And yet, there are a lot of individuals, as Ms. Watson would say, that do not want to be in shelters because of paranoia, because of general fearfulness, and of course many times they've been hurt in shelters. My old church, Jeff Street Baptist Chapel, before the Southern Baptists threw us out, we were a respite shelter, and we would give homeless people individual little Sunday school rooms that had long fallen into disuse. And that seemed to help a bit. If they had a private space, all of us like privacy. But in terms of, I don't know what the Louisville Coalition would say now. Probably nationally, 20 to 30% have a SMI, serious mental illness. But that figure might be dropping because so many blue-collar Americans are losing their place in our society. The downward drift is becoming a downward rush. I don't know where Kevin went, but, oh, sorry.
Anybody help me cast some things out?
Oh, please. Yes. And also, since this is a church, I put my personal phone number. If you have any questions, I'm always happy. I do return phone calls, and I'm always delighted to talk to people in congregation. Believe it or not, my first job at Southern Baptist was talking about alcoholism. Southern Baptists in the 70s and 80s had the highest rate of alcoholism of all of the mainline denominations. So I flew all over the country for our Baptist agency, trying to do education and also trying to encourage Southern Baptist churches to establish AA meetings. And there were times I was escorted to the parking lot. But I lasted for a year. Yeah, yes, and I'm embarrassed. I put in the wrong number. I had to scratch out on some. I caught it mid-run. Y'all have been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.